it was in the limitations that they felt were upon them that they got more creative. And I feel like
put those back on.
I feel like Kitase, even in recent interviews, has said things like, "I miss those days because we felt like we had to really think outside the box."
Right.
And that's where I think. Welcome back to the State of the Arc podcast. My name is Mike.
My name is Kason.
We are joined today by our good friend Ryan, also known as the Night Sky Prince online. How are you, dude?
Oh, man, I'm awesome. You know, I'm starting to think, like, am I too old to be Night Sky Prince? Should I just change it? Should I just be Night Sky now?
Do you
Twitter,
rule a
kingdom yet?
Now known as X. Yeah. You, well, why don't you explain that real quick? You had a kind of shadow ban thing going on there. And your new X account is Night Sky King, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's Night Sky King now. So I cannot tell you for the life of me what I did, what I said, what rule I broke. But I have an account, my main account, with 17,000 followers. And only like maybe 20 people see my posts. It's ridiculous.
I'm one of them, by the way, just so you know. I see everything you freaking put out, so I don't know what was going on with that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I have no idea what happened. I was looking at my impressions chart, and like it's just downward. I don't know what I did. So I created a new account at @NightSkyKing_. And immediately the engagement just started pouring in again. And people were like, what happened to you? I thought you like disappeared. I said, no, I'm still on here. So if anyone wants to find out where I am, it's at @NightSkyKing_, where you can actually see my posts.
All right. Well, whatever you did, don't do that again.
This podcast is brought to you by the Night Sky King Twitter account. 20% off if you go sign up and follow.
20% off of
use
zero.
the QR code, the code Resident Arc. You can follow
link in the description below.
Link in the description. That's our first, our very first. Is it the first? I think it's the first sponsorship that we've had on this version of the podcast.
That's it.
Welcoming in sponsorships at this point. That's the first one, Night Sky King. Thanks for joining us, dude. We appreciate you. It's been a really long time since we've spoken with you last. We were just talking before we hit record. I think the last time we spoke was that final episode of the Final Fantasy 16 series that we did. So it's been quite a while, over a year. Yeah. And we've been doing more Final Fantasy content lately after a long hiatus from it.
Yes.
We've been doing some episodes on Final Fantasy music. At the time this goes live, you will have seen all the way up through Final Fantasy 9. We've kind of covered the history of the musical soundtracks and things like that. And so been talking about it more recently. So we wanted to have you on because I saw a video that you made a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was last week, as the time of recording this, where you brought up a topic where the question was essentially, I guess we should maybe set this up with Final Fantasy as a series has been struggling to meet sales expectations.
Yeah.
At least that is something that has been reported or maybe is rumored. You being a little bit more plugged into that stuff than I am at this point, how actually legitimately true is that?
It seems to be quite true. We've heard it from Square Enix in their financial reports.
Okay.
And then we're also hearing it from industry analysts that they're looking at the numbers and things aren't looking particularly hot. So it does seem to be quite true. The thing that makes it really difficult as well is that, a lot of people, and I mentioned this in the video, kind of like saw this as an issue that started kind of with 16 and Rebirth coming out. But really, when you trace it back, even during Final Fantasy 15's development, if you do enough research before, the conversion to 15 and when Tabata taking over, essentially they were like, the brand is diminishing and damaged. And so they anticipated that Final Fantasy 15 was going to sell under 5 million units.
Really?
And Tabata kind of came in there and he was like, no, our sales goal should be 6 million and beyond, right? Because they were kind of looking at, kind of the situation with the reception of 13, 14 1.0, did tremendous damage to the brand reputation. And so at the time, they were kind of thinking that they were on like a slope for how this was going to go. And so, at least from Square Enix's POV, things have kind of been going downhill in terms of the brand's size for quite some time. Like the amount of people who are really interested in this series. And I think we've kind of finally hit that head with these most recent games. And I don't even think that the most recent games are necessarily the worst of like modern FF, because I know modern FF can actually be quite contentious. Like from a gameplay standpoint, I actually really enjoyed Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I talk about it all the time. I have, quite a few narrative contentions with it for sure, but I actually thought from a game standpoint, that game was actually pretty exceptional.
That's what I've heard.
But the brand itself seems to have a problem. If I was to basically summarize what I think that problem is that you have a lot of us old guys who are still really interested in Final Fantasy. But that number is kind of diminishing. And then
we're dying
you
off.
Also have right. And then you also have the younger audience, which isn't really picking it up as fast as they necessarily could be.
Yeah.
Okay. So
yeah,
I'm actually going to rely on you pretty heavily for this because, like I said, I used to be very plugged in terms of news coming out from Square Enix and Final Fantasy and following up on things like sales figures. I don't know any of that stuff right now. Yeah. I am totally unplugged from it. I'm as ignorant as I can be on these things. So don't yell at me if Nice Game Prince says something wrong. Not to throw you under the bus or anything, but do we know like what the sales figures are, or are they kind of keeping those close to the chest?
So we haven't really gotten official updates for either game. 16 came out of the gate strong with 3 million sales, and then Square never offered any update after that. Currently, there is this article that's published. I don't know if it's going to be dated or not, but as of the day of this recording, they were saying 3.5 million in sales for 16. I don't know
in
if
total,
that's
even after the PC release.
Well, that's probably just what's publicly available, right?
We don't know if that's like accurate yet, so I don't want to go into too much detail on that. And then Rebirth situation, we actually don't have any sales figures at all. Now with Rebirth also as well, Final Fantasy sequels typically don't sell that well. Looking back as far as like 10-2, 13-2, with the whole 13 trilogy, each game sold less than the last one. So it hasn't really been, we were kind of expecting maybe that this game would kind of break the curse in a way, because this was the first Final Fantasy sequel that actually tried at least to be bigger and better than the last.
Interesting.
Because most of them are kind of asset flips, much smaller in scale. They tend to be half the length of their predecessor, etc.
Well, you could say that while the original games were AAA level games, that the sequels stooped down into the AA territory.
I have not played Lightning Returns. I have played a little bit of Final Fantasy 13-2. I didn't beat that game, and then I have played Final Fantasy 10-2. But from what I remember, I don't know. Have you played those games, Ryan?
Yeah, I played all of them. Yeah, I played all of them.
Okay, so in terms of, I don't know, like budget that would have gone into those sequel titles, were they pretty much on par with Final Fantasy 13? Or do you think that there were a lot of asset flips and things like that going on?
So the budget was definitely not nearly as much. For starters, they were like half the length, right? I think like 13-2, my first playthrough was like 26 hours, and I think it took me like around 50-ish for 13, right?
Yeah, right.
So they're much shorter. Lightning Returns is also about 20-ish hours. Lightning Returns also budget cuts. You could just kind of see like in like the development of the world, some of the textures and the models. Even at the time, I was kind of like, oh, they did not put as much into this as they did with Final Fantasy 13, where it's a very gorgeous game. And Lightning Returns, you kind of go around and you look at stuff and you can kind of tell like, okay, this is where some areas where the budget like ran thin a little bit. Rebirth is kind of a different situation though, because some stuff was almost somewhat unnecessary. I feel like actually all the main character models for Cloud and everyone are actually entirely redone for PlayStation 5.
Really?
And I thought that the PS4 models looked just fine. The environments had some issues, yes, but like the actual main character models looked good. But they actually redid like all the main character models for that game, and they look great, by the way. Like there is like maybe like a 10 or 20% improvement from like where they were in terms of like how much fidelity they got out of that. But it looks great. But yeah, Rebirth is probably the first time I've seen them step up budget and scale from the last game when we're doing like a direct sequel for sure.
Okay. All right. So I just want to, if we can, establish and again, you've done more research on this. You did your video recently. How is it that we're quantifying? Is it just the Square Enix reports where they say these aren't meeting sales expectations, or is there some other metric that we can use to sort of establish that the brand is diminishing in either its reach or sales power or something like that? Are we just taking the financial reports as like as an evidence for this, or is there something more to it than that?
So I think you can just honestly look at the numbers, and that kind of says it all. Numbers don't really lie. I think that like if you were to say look at Final Fantasy X and like what that sold in Japan alone, that was like 3.2 million units, right? And of course, it's hard to decouple Final Fantasy from the PlayStation brand, not only because it's not available on Switch in Japan, and the PlayStation brand has declined so much in Japan, as well as the fact that, you know, now these games are launching as PlayStation exclusives. And so because that game has, because the hardware needed to play the game has declined in Japan, one of the main territories in which these games sell is no longer able to buy them. Now, they're still actually doing really well relative to other games that are launching for PS5. Like if you look at the top sales charts for PS5, Final Fantasy 16 and Rebirth are at like the very top, right?
Oh, really?
I think they were only surpassed recently by Monster Hunter Wilds. So it's not like even relative to PlayStation performance that they're necessarily doing bad. But just there, the number of PlayStations being sold isn't quite as much. However, when you look at things globally, it's not like the numbers are changing much globally either. So it's not as though it's selling stronger here in the West. That kind of was the case with, say, Final Fantasy 15, where it did pick up a lot of Western traction, and it also kept a decent amount of Japanese fans as well. However, you know, if you look back, and if you look at, say, any other series, right? So say, let's say look at Resident Evil, for example, and you look at Resident Evil 2 Remake. Right. Okay, well, Resident Evil 2 Remake is now the highest selling Resident Evil game, I believe. It's at like 15 million units.
Wow.
Dang.
Well, if you look at Resident Evil...
It was a good remake.
Yeah. And if you look at Resident Evil 2, though, the original on PS1, I believe it was around 5 million units.
Yeah.
Right? So that's selling 3 times as much.
Very interesting.
Final Fantasy 7 Remake Part 1 selling 7 million. And then, like, you know, I think Final Fantasy 7 with all re-releases combined is at 14 million.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So we're looking at the reverse of what happened with Resident Evil, where you know, tripled in sales for the remake.
This is interesting.
Half of those sales.
Do you know what that tells me? Yeah. Just those numbers on their face. What that tells me is that Silent Hill 2 was able to find that new audience.
Resident Evil 2, yeah.
Resident Evil 2 was able to find that new audience that that the investors are always looking for, right? Oh, we need to find a new audience. Let's find the younger people. When you sell more than the original, you did it. You found the new audience, right? Yeah. If you're selling half of the original on a remake, I don't think you found that new audience. And that they may have been going for that, but who ended up buying it, maybe not so much, right? Now, I'm not, this isn't a total statement that that's for sure, but that's a sign that you didn't break into any new market, and that this is a typical decline as if it were a sequel. This is almost Final Fantasy VII 2, because if we look at the numbers, Final Final Fantasy 13-2 sold about half of what 13 sold, right?
Yeah.
Final Fantasy 7 Remake sold about half of what Final Fantasy 7 sold. It's like they had an install base, and the gradual, decrease on that, it seems to mirror, right? These are Final Fantasy 7 fans who went out and bought it, and maybe not so much brand new players who never played Final Fantasy 7. Despite what many of you in the comments will say, that it was your first Final Fantasy game. Good for you. I'm talking about the millions of other people,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you this too, really quick. There's kind of a lot of factors to consider, which I'm sure you have done. Like, for instance, Final Fantasy VII Remake was available on the PlayStation 4, which had a much larger install base.
That's right, it did.
Than Final Fantasy Rebirth on the PlayStation 5, because I'm pretty sure it was exclusive to PS5 for a while, right?
Yeah.
So there's factors like that. There are factors like the one that you just went over where, at least in the Japanese market, home consoles as a whole have diminished tremendously. People do not play games on a home console in Japan like they used to.
Yeah.
They play on mobile devices on the train and commutes, and they want to be able to take it with them on a handheld device.
Yeah.
There's also PC market and the way that has changed things in recent years. And so, I mean, but Rebirth, of course, did just have its PC release recently, I think within the last month or so. So how many of these factors affect these sales figures? Are these just bad business decisions by Square Enix to have a PlayStation 5 exclusive launch? Or is this something more than that? Does this really show a decline in interest amongst sort of the general gaming audience with the brand? And how do we delineate that? How do we factor all of that in? How much fault, percentage-wise, are we putting on Square Enix's business decisions versus, well, the product is just not something that's aligning with players like it once did? How are we delineating those two things, and how are we determining that? Or I guess I should ask you directly, how are you viewing that?
Okay. Yeah, very difficult question. First of all, I think that multi-platform is the most immediate thing that they can do to have the biggest impact, right? It's the thing that costs the least and would have the most impact in the short term. I do think that there is an issue with brand as well. But, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example, had what seems to be a fairly strong PC launch. A lot of people bought it. Not being on PC day one, I think, is kind of a huge mistake. We're seeing a lot of games right now explode on PC. And I think Capcom says that they consider PC to be like their main platform, and like 50% of their revenue comes from like PC sales, wow. I want to say. I think I've read an article on that. Yeah, just recently with them saying that. So,
well, PC is also a little easier to develop for, famously.
It kind of depends. I mean, it depends on, like in this case, they would have been developing Final Fantasy on PlayStation first because it was planned for that. Then they would have had to, port that over, and that can be actually
it's not
really
easy.
complicated. Yeah. And they have famously had a lot of issues with their PC ports, with performance and other things. So,
but if you program for the PC as your main, then
if that's a consideration from the start.
Yeah, it seems to be that when you make a game for PC first, and then you port the consoles, everything goes so much smoother.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then when you start, because the thing is, I suspect that a lot of developers, because of how much time and budget they're given, they make sure that the console versions of games are running phenomenal. And then when it comes to PC, it's kind of just like, well, fans will fix it.
Yeah, because there's large modding communities. People always sort of like flock to that, and
they're not wrong. But I don't. Like
it is. It's a bad business practice to rely on that, right?
Yeah.
Right, and we've seen it happen so many times, right? Like where game comes out and performs terribly on PC, And then like 2 weeks later, you know, some guy, maybe not even 2 weeks later, sometimes like within that week, some guy has like figured it out and he's like, yeah, you just got to replace these files and change this thing and install my mod. And then all of a sudden it's working amazing.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Did Dragon's Dogma ever get a fix for its issues, or is it still bad on PC?
From my understanding, I think that RE Engine is just really bad with big open worlds because Monster Hunter Wilds is also having a lot of issues on PC to the point of where you have places like Digital Foundry being like, yeah, just don't buy it unless you have like, you know, like a 4080 or something.
Yeah. See, Dragon's Dogma wasn't horrible for me, but it's because I did have a 4090, which was new at the time. Yeah. But like most people who are playing on, you know, what would be mid or lower end PCs, just it's basically unplayable in certain parts. So, okay. So, anyways, getting back to the question here, how much are you putting this on Square Enix's business practices and exclusivity versus declining fan interest or general gaming interest in the brand?
You know, I feel like I kind of feel like they're both one and the same in a way. I feel like your business decisions, like choosing exclusivity, also does impact fans or the brand growth because it impacts how many people can access the game. But then I also feel like too, there's maybe an issue in isolation where the brand just isn't as appealing as it used to be to a younger audience, because we also have to remember and ask why Sony wanted FF to be an exclusive in the first place. And that's because traditionally FF really moved hardware.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Very strong brand. It's, you know, when the new Final Fantasy game is coming out, you would go and pick up a PlayStation specifically to play the new Final Fantasy. Right.
Yeah.
And I do think that for some people, it still does have that appeal, but is it having that appeal for, say, maybe like a Gen Z audience? And then after that, you know, the upcoming Gen Alpha audience, that I haven't really seen too much evidence of. Right. And I mean, when you look around the Final Fantasy community, you look at, you know, analytics on my own videos, you know, it seems to be mostly guys my age. You know, not that that's bad, but you know, in terms of obviously not, we're all still very young, but in terms of like, you know, like maybe like 18 to 25, that audience, is it really growing in that area? And that seems to be kind of the issue. And Yoshi P has really talked about this too when 16 was coming out, where he was saying that like, you know, younger generation and their expectations and how they're making this game for them. And one of the reasons that he said that, you know, they felt the need to lean into action combat was because the younger generation is so used to playing games in real time that for them, it might be a struggle for them to understand, you know, oh, you have to go through a menu and select a command, then wait your turn for a character to, you know, and to do all that. And so they felt like they had a need to lean into real time.
That's
and whether that's
underselling the youth, I think. But
yeah, I think it is, because I think that when you look at, say, like what MiHoYo is doing with Honkai Star Rail, for example, very, very big turn-based game, and also huge Gen Z audience. I think that Persona 5 also, I mean, you look at the whole Persona series and how that's exploded over the past few years.
Okay, this is so funny because what you were just saying before, I had a thought that I just kind of let pass as the conversation continued. However, since you just brought up Honkai Star Rail and Persona 5, I'm just going to throw this out there. Final Fantasy is really not interested in maintaining their Japanese roots as much. I don't think. At least I haven't.
I think that's fair to say. I think that for a long time, actually. I mean, you even go back. You go back to FF7, the original game. A big goal of theirs was to reach a Western market so they could break 1 million sales. It was all about getting outside to the global market. I think that has been a focus for them.
I feel like they may have pursued that a little too much. Part of the appeal of a lot of these Japanese role-playing games was the Japanese-ness of them, right? You see
Sure.
it pretty heavily in games like Suikoden. You see it pretty heavily in the earlier Final Fantasy games, as much as they were trying to court maybe the more Dungeons and Dragons Western kind of style. Their Japanese-ness just oozed out of those games, and there's nothing they could do about it. I even noticed it a lot in like Super Mario RPG, and so then you're bringing up Honkai and Persona as these games that are really gaining a lot of traction, and I'm thinking those games are embracing the Japanese-ness of what they are, like heavily.
Chinese
whereas Final
for
Fantasy is
Honkai.
abandoning it. Go again.
Oh, I said Chinese for Honkai.
Oh, is that Chinese?
Yeah,
oh, dang. But either way,
I'm
there's an
because
appeal.
they do Genshin Impact and they
Genshin
do
is a Japanese word. I didn't know that these were Chinese.
What was the other one? My buddy Bryce just showed it to me. It's like a brawler type game. Anyway.
Oh, is it ZZZ?
Yes, ZZZ.
I think that's
I
that.
don't know about that.
Yeah. So he was showing me that. He's really into that. And
That's hilarious because
yeah.
Genshin and Honkai, it's just Japanese to me is what that says. But that's fine. Either way, it is the Eastern Asian influence that's foreign and interesting almost in that way, where it's just like, oh, this is cool. This is different from, the other games that I played. It's different from the culture that I grew up in. It's fascinating, right? Whereas I think Final Fantasy has tried to really put that away and try to be the culture that the Western people grew up in, and try to eliminate all of that Japanese flavor that made their game so interesting. I loved the clash of cultures, or the embrace of cultures between Japanese and the West that resulted in a lot of these earlier RPGs. And the more that gets eliminated, I think the more these games are failing. And I know it sounds, I don't know, it's like people don't care that much about Japan, but I'll tell you what, Nintendo maintains a ton of that Japanese influence in their games, even their modern ones, even Breath of the Wild with like Kakariko Village and stuff. And it's fascinating and really cool. And I think people just really do appreciate that a lot. Whereas with Final Fantasy 16, you get that game and then you compare it to, I don't know, The Witcher, Elder Scrolls, whatever other games that you have around. And it's like, it doesn't really stand out.
Yeah.
It doesn't really look any different.
I think that's a fair point. I want to ask you something really quick, Ryan. So we've got Riker's Beard here in our Discord, and I just want to get your beat on this take really quick and some of the numbers here. So he says, my biggest problem with the PS5 exclusivity argument, as for why the games aren't selling as well, is that why didn't we see basically a boost or a significant boost once they released on PC? He goes on to say, Square just announced that to their shareholders, that 16 has only sold 3.5 million copies to date in the last 2 years.
Oh, that's rough.
Which means if the articles at the same, I don't know if
it's to be believed.
If it's to be believed, that means that only 500,000 copies were sold after the first month. And it also never factors in people who buy PS5 exclusives just for the novelty of having it as an exclusive. So
there's a few factors. He did bring up, though, that article may not have the most accurate information.
Yeah, so I was going to ask about that. I was like, do those sales figures sound correct to you based on what you've read?
The sales figures of
the
3.5,
yeah.
3.5 in total, meaning if it sold 3 million in its first month when it was on PS5,
it's only
that
sold,
since then it's only sold somewhere around 500,000 copies, and that would include PC.
Yeah, that doesn't really math to me.
It doesn't sound
I don't
right.
know.
Yeah.
I don't know. It doesn't sound right. My estimate was like 4 to 4.5 million
in total.
Right? Yeah, in total. That's what I'm thinking.
And so you're thinking that the PC release might have given it a boost of about 1 million or something like that?
I would say that it's probably sold another 500,000 at least on PS5, and then maybe like 500,000 from the PC.
Okay, so like 500,000.
All right, so I think it's closer to 4.
After that initial 3 million launch, it's had about 500,000, you would say, on PS5 and about 500,000 in its PC launch. So I'm just to get his response here. I linked where the CEO directly states the 3.5 million figure above. Also, just need to Google Translate it.
Right.
So he's
Right.
he feels that what has been stated here is that it is to this date 3.5 million total for Final Fantasy 16.
Right.
A brief update here. Night Sky Prince did say this information was disputed, and his own estimates are higher than 3.5 million. I just want to say he has good instincts because, as was pointed out here on X by the account Genki_JPN, Toyo Securities analyst Hideki Yasuda has apologized for his incorrect statement about Final Fantasy XVI sales figures. He says the 3.5 million copies sold figure was not said by Square Enix president Takashi Kiryu at the financial results briefing and has corrected his report to say that the figure was based on Toyo Securities' own estimates. So that clarifies things up a little bit. The number is probably higher, but we just don't know.
Let's put it like this. Whether it's 3.5 million or 4.5 million, either one of those numbers would put it in the lowest selling 3D Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
Ooh, ouch.
Ever, right?
Ouch.
So right, like basically, yeah, like out of every game 7 onward, it put it on like the lowest end of that spectrum.
Wow, that, you know what? That's funny. That's like, that would be comparable or even less than Final Fantasy 9.
Yeah,
right. Because I think 9's PS1 release, so like 5 million. So it would be like below F9,
less than F9. Dang.
So yeah, that would still be pretty bad. And I don't think that the PlayStation brand has necessarily declined enough to justify it entirely on multi-platform. So I actually agree, because we have to remember Final Fantasy VII, I believe, was the number 2 best-selling game on PS1.
It was right behind Gran Turismo, I think it was. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, right behind Gran Turismo. So, and then Final Fantasy X was a huge success, and all the ones in between that were also like huge successes. And for the longest, they were also PlayStation exclusive.
Yeah.
And I think when you look at the type of game that, you know, Final Fantasy is, which is a very narrative heavy game, cinematic style, the types of gamers that enjoy those games are on PlayStation, because that's where they are. Like that's like
that makes sense.
The console that you get. It would be like saying that, like, if a platformer that was exclusive to Nintendo Switch failed, it's like, oh, well, the reason it failed is because it was like on Nintendo Switch. No, because all the platform heads, like, they love it.
That's actually a really good point right there. That's a really good point.
Right.
PlayStation is the place to be for this type of thing, unless you're going to argue the PC thing. Now we kind of we're just going to sweep that under the rug right now.
The thing is I think PC will give you a significant boost. But I don't know if there are examples, maybe you know of one, where the PC version of a PlayStation 5 game outsold what it did on PlayStation 5. You know what I mean?
That's a good point.
I think you can get a good boost. And if you were to launch them at the same time, probably you would get like a really nice boost. But I still don't know if like the PC market for this type of game would necessarily be outsold on PC. Does that sound accurate to you, Ryan?
For the most part, yeah. Like, I think it happens when you have a CRPG like Baldur's Gate 3 and it's really PC focused.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
but when we're talking, but when we're talking about in general PC ports, you know, we're talking about adding maybe a couple million. So like 1, 2, 3. But it's not doing as heavy the numbers that say like PlayStation sales are. There are some exceptions, like, you know, if you have Black Myth Wukong and you have a huge Chinese audience, and consoles have been banned for like a long time in China up until recently, and then it sells like, you know, an extreme amount on PC. Capcom, again, one of their main platforms is PC, but again, a lot of these sales are still coming from PlayStation. So yes, being on PC day one does make a difference. And I also think that being on PC day one will actually make things sell more on PC, because when the thing is available through multiple channels, multiple platforms, I mean, on day one, while the marketing is at its strongest.
Exactly.
Right, you know, because it's hard to be like, Right. Remember that game? You won it 1 year ago? Well, now it's on the platform that you prefer to play.
See, that's why I'm not too surprised
really
about
works.
the PC sales being low.
Yeah,
where it's like,
me either.
look, man, every company that's like, oh, a year later, except for freaking like Alan Wake, or there's a few examples, right, where the PC release gave it a huge boost. But for the most part, it's like that's old news at that point. So don't expect a PC release to really rejuvenate your game when it's been out for a year already and people are looking for something else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And most people are pretty heavily influenced by, what's currently being played and not like what game of the year last year was or whatever.
Well, I have another thought though, because you were saying that the people who are expecting this, heavily cinematic experience, well, just that PlayStation is the brand that you would go to for a game like Final Fantasy, right? So it's not that they're missing the target audience too heavily by being an exclusive for the PlayStation. However, it could indicate that people aren't looking for those types of games as much anymore now, and that would be a broader trend that is, instead of the diminishment being because they're exclusive, the diminishment is because there's less people interested in this specific, demographic that they've been going for 30 years.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's the case. That just, could be an indicator there.
Well, here's
like
kind
story
of,
focused,
Yeah, here's kind of my next thought as we're trying to sort of navigate establishing what the problem is, if there is one.
Yeah.
Because again, it's coming from the horse's mouth. The games are selling below expectations.
Yeah.
However, they are fairly well received critically.
Yeah, they tend to be. Yeah,
Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was a Game of the Year nominee and seemed to have more or less universal acclaim and praise from the media. And I don't know, I haven't checked on its like Metacritic user score or something like that. But would it be fair to say that like, above 90% approval from those who played it?
Yeah. Very, very, very strong approval. So much so that there has been a strong sentiment in the community that they want Final Fantasy 17, essentially, at least in terms of combat, to play more like Rebirth than anything else they've been trying. Purely because, oh my God, man, if you like Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat, I would probably go as far as to say Rebirth has some of my favorite RPG combat of all time. Actually, I'd probably place it at number 1.
That's cool.
I think the gameplay in that game is that strong. Now, where it gets contentious with Rebirth is that actually Rebirth is such a massive game that a lot of the content they probably could have cut. There are arguably too many mini games. That's what a lot of people feel like.
Which is crazy.
I
haven't heard anyone say that about a modern game. Like, there's too many mini games. Are you kidding me? That's wild, right?
Yeah. Yes, I know. And like a modern Final Fantasy too.
Right.
Which I kind of feel like, oh God, I'm like so in the middle on that. Because on one hand, I'm like, yeah, they probably did like maybe overstep with some of them, but I'm like, let's not like discourage them and try to make them get rid of mini games.
Right,
because we had to beg for a really long time for these things to come back.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are actually like really exceptional too. Like there's this one game that's inspired by Gwent pretty heavily. It's called Queen's Blood, and it's really good. I adore that mini game. So I don't want to scare them away from that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay, so we have a game that is super well received, that is highly acclaimed. So what do we pin on the fall off in sales after the initial sort of launch window? Yeah. Because Final Fantasy VII didn't sell 10 million units on the PlayStation in its first year.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
While, yeah.
That's something that had a long tail.
Yeah.
And long tails come from word of mouth. They come from you're going to your buddy's place and like, holy crap, dude, this game's so sweet. Right. You got to play this. Oh, now I got to go get it. Right. Like those long tails are an indication that this is something that's spreading and that people are sharing with each other.
Right.
So why again, and this is based on the assumption we're making, not having all the data in front of us, based on the assumption that we're seeing these sort of really sharp sort of fall-offs in sales for these games. What is it that's causing that? I don't know. So I think people are pretty well aware of like my feelings on a lot of the modern Final Fantasy games, but I'm really not trying to like step into my feelings on this as part of this sort of discussion or analysis, right? I'm kind of like leaving that out of it. I'm trying to understand more from like an impartial point of view, like what's going on, and trying to like see where the trend is taking us and what are the factors affecting this, without any of my kind of like personal feelings about these games getting in the way. But like I also said, I've been a bit unplugged from the community, and I don't really know what discussions about Rebirth look like the way that maybe I was aware of for Remake in 2020. So I'm going to rely on you again, Ryan. What is that word of mouth like for games like Rebirth and 16? Is that a major factor, or do you think it's something else?
Well, both games, and then probably could be said about any Final Fantasy game, really, they have really passionate communities that definitely do spread the word. You know, speaking of games that I think really took off because of word of mouth from Square Enix, even Nier Automata, man.
Yeah.
Nier Automata has been selling like 1 million units each year since it has come out. It has the most insane tale that they've had for like any of their games. You know how many it's at now? It's at 9 million.
Yeah, that's
crazy.
Yeah, and it's actually baffling to me. Well, not so much. It's baffling if you don't know who Yoko Taro is, but that they wouldn't have released another Nier game yet. I mean, it's been 10 years since.
That's a good point.
Is it 10 or 9 years since Nier Automata came out?
Whenever 9-ish
years ago.
9 years.
It seems almost like unfathomable that they wouldn't have released another Nier game.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're still waiting for Elder Scrolls 6.
That Bethesda's a whole different animal. But when you know the kind of guy Yoko Taro is, and probably his refusal to do it, like you probably get a better understanding for why it hasn't happened yet. But that's a great example to bring up, right? Games like that, or we're talking about some of the Final Fantasy games from the PlayStation 1 era, maybe Final Fantasy X as well. They had these really long tails like this.
Right.
And it's not the case, I would say, probably since Final Fantasy 12? Now Final Fantasy 13 was successful. Final Fantasy 15 probably
15.
did.
15 had a great tale, actually.
But
I can tell you also why 15 had a great tale.
Yeah. Which other one did you just say?
Well, I was saying that 15 had a great tale, and it was in part because of things like the Royal Edition, but also the fact that they kept adding content to it.
Yeah.
And that content kept keeping it relevant.
That's right.
And so even though everybody hated that releasing structure, it's hard to say that, you know, having an anime that was free on YouTube and constantly releasing DLC so that fans would be like, you know, oh my God, I can't believe this and this happened, and now we get to control this character, and
now the car can
having
fly.
people spread the word about. Right, now the car can fly, and like all these other things that kept the game talked about, that kept the game relevant on social media, didn't have a positive impact on sales. Now, I wouldn't want them to structure another game quite like that, and I think that we've also seen games that are doing well that don't necessarily have to do something like that. If they had a game where the story was better suited for that type of content and it didn't make you necessarily feel like you played a game that got gutted for the sake of downloadable content, I don't think as many people would have necessarily minded it that much. But with that game, that sentiment was just way too strong.
I think you're bringing up a really good point, because I don't think anyone would argue that Final Fantasy 16 or the 7 remake or rebirth projects were like more divisive than Final Fantasy 15 was. Like Final Fantasy 15 had a lot of people upset and disappointed and arguing about whether it's any good. Right? It certainly did. And I'll take another step back really quickly just to say, I think basically every mainline Final Fantasy game outside of 14 1.0 is a highly polished product. Like these are pretty good games across the board. There's not one you could point to if you're being like truly honest and objective about it. Say this is a bad video game or a trash video game or something like that. But they certainly more divisive in recent years, probably starting with 13. I remember 12 had a little bit of it, but 13, I remember the first time where people were really like arguing, like, okay, Final Fantasy has taken a big step back.
Right.
And that has been going on, yet, in even that being true for 15, it has this incredible sales tail and sells a lot.
Right.
So what's the difference? I don't think we can just pin it on something like bad word of mouth, because there was
16?
bad word of mouth for 15, and it had a tail because of its releasing structure, like Ryan is talking about. Now, I'm not even aware of this. This is how unplugged I am. Has there been DLC for Final Fantasy 16? Is that out?
I've heard there.
Yeah,
is.
there's been two.
Really?
One is just there's yeah. Honestly,
I
they're
honestly
not anything.
had no idea.
Okay, so they're not really on the scale of something like Final Fantasy 15.
Okay.
So like 15, like the DLC added like a new playable character. Every single one of them added new playable characters and new features to the game and that type of stuff. Whereas like the two DLCs, one is an extra icon fight with Leviathan, and then the one before that was like an extra dungeon, and then that was pretty much it. So I don't think that.
So they weren't major.
Most people would probably agree.
DLCs.
No, not in the way that 15 was. I feel like 15's DLCs were actually fairly substantial for that game.
Right.
To the point of where people were actually kind of aggravated by that. Like it felt too substantial sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that plot point should have definitely been in the game. That should not have been, relegated to a DLC coming a year later. But
so what how large was the expansion on Remake? I forget what that was called, the Yuffie thing.
Oh,
So that was like about 5 hours if you mainline it. About
5
10
hours
if you like really dig. Yeah.
Oh wow, I thought it was longer than that. So it's short.
It's pretty short, but it's probably one of my favorite pieces of DLC for the series because it's not a DLC like 15 where it's something that like is so crucial that if you don't play it, then like good luck trying to like understand the game. But it was just kind of like this really interesting side story about Yuffie, and you learn some of things about her lore that were not included in the original game. And it was really fun too, because it actually introduced some of Rebirth's mechanics ahead of time into the first game's kind of system. So it was really cool, getting to play as Yuffie ahead of time, getting to like see some new mechanics that would be built up for the next parts. And so I actually really liked Intermission. That's what
Intermission
was
the name of it.
See.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm asking a lot of questions here because there's a lot of stuff I don't know. I'm just trying to get the best.
Go for it. Go for it.
Grip in this short space I can on things before I start actually adding anything of substance to this conversation. So I want to get to something Riker's Beard is saying here again, but I also wanted to ask you about the latest Final Fantasy 14 expansion as well. What was that called? Dawn Trail or something like that?
Dawn Trail. Yes.
Okay. We'll get to your personal feelings on it in a second because I actually have not heard that either. But I have heard much more mixed feelings on this than previous Final Fantasy 14 expansions. Is that fair to say?
That's quite fair to say.
And this is from like a story standpoint or also from quests and story or gameplay side of things too?
So people enjoyed the battle mechanics probably the most that they have. But in terms of questing structure and narrative, it was pretty divisive.
And who wrote this one in comparison to past expansions?
A brand new writer. He's not entirely new. He had worked on some side quests and raids before. But so Natsuko Ishikawa has stepped into a supervisor position. And a lot of people are thinking that she's working on a new game. It might be Final Fantasy 17, who knows? But typically when you get promoted like that and you're only supervising, it's kind of like, what is she doing full time? Because she's just like basically reviewing the other guy's writing and approving it. So a lot of people are suspecting that she's also working on a new project because she's not as intimately involved with 14 anymore.
And which ones did she write? Was that like Heaven's Ward or was it later?
She wrote part of Stormblood. She wrote Shadowbringers and Endwalker as well.
And Shadowbringers, is that what it's called? Is one of the most highly regarded ones, right?
Oh my God. It might be my favorite FF story ever, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, Shadowbringers is awesome.
So she's considered a really excellent writer on the Final Fantasy XIV side, and she was not the main writer for Dawn Trail.
Correct.
Okay. So we have examples of Final Fantasy XVI not meeting sales expectations and having a short tail. We have the latest Final Fantasy XIV expansion being a bit disappointing for fans generally. We have Final Fantasy VII Rebirth not meeting sales expectations despite being highly critically acclaimed.
Right.
So we kind of have, is it fair to call this 3 major Final Fantasy brand releases in a row that have been underwhelming financially or critically? Would that be fair to say that that's where we're at?
Yeah. Well, and especially with Dawn Trail, right? I think the last time I checked the Metascore on that, it was at like 79, which is pretty rough considering where the expansions normally place, right? I think Shadowbringers and Endwalker have like a 92, right? Yeah. So that's a pretty sharp decline. And I want to say it's the lowest rated expansion pack. Yeah, it is the lowest rated expansion pack. So, that's pretty rough, you know? And then also too, I think if I'm not mistaken, Final Fantasy XIV in general is kind of on a decline in terms of players. I think they had hit peak concurrence during the release of Dawn Trail, but the current state, from what I've seen, their numbers have kind of hit like a decline there as well. So.
Okay. So Square finds themselves in a financial situation with sort of like where we are currently with the brand, in a place where there seems to be a decline in interest among the general gaming audience, where sales are down, and where there's been a lot more divisive reception for certain titles. And not to say there's still some that are hitting those peaks like FF7 Rebirth or something like that. Right. But it's in a place where just generally the brand does not feel as strong as it once did.
Right.
And we've talked about lots of different factors for why they could be, a split between business decisions and exclusivity in the modern market where maybe that worked in the past, but maybe not for today.
Well, I wonder how lucrative their deal with Sony is.
Sure. Like
it could be that it's still well worth it for them to stay exclusive because Sony is providing X number of marketing dollars and this other type of support and bundles and maybe possibly even upfront cash as well. Like here. I don't know the deal though. If anybody has any insight in that, let me know. Well, but there is a deal that covers for some of these weak points we're talking about.
If I'm not mistaken, isn't this kind of a thing that's coming to an end now, Ryan? They're not going to keep doing PS5 exclusives moving forward?
Correct. And, you know, my understanding is that if they're going to stop doing it, then whatever money that Sony was offering them has not been enough to cover for whatever they've been losing by not having it be multi-platform.
Right. Okay. There's also some long-term there because if a company pays you for exclusivity, that's great. But what if your brand declines during this exclusivity era, right, where it's all exclusive here, and then by the time the exclusivity ends, then it's like, oh, hey, everybody, we're back, and it's like no one cares about you anymore because you limited your audience too much by taking that exclusivity. So it's almost like a maybe short to maybe even midterm benefit, the exclusivity, but then a long-term deficit because you just spent a lot of time outside of a lot of people's eyes who otherwise would have seen it. So that money would have to be pretty substantial to cover that. And at some point you could even look back and say, that wasn't worth it.
Yeah. So
and in a way you can also take it further than that because you could say that like we used to have a new Final Fantasy like yearly, right? And if you didn't like Final Fantasy, let's say 8, Final Fantasy 9 was like right there.
I know, 1 year later.
A year later. And if you didn't like 8 or 9, 10 was coming.
Yeah.
Right. And then around 12, we started to see it take a lot more time. And then around 13 took even more time. Yeah. And then every one of them after that took more and more and more time. And so the release gap is pretty strong. And,
which means all the eggs are in one basket now, right? It used to be more diversified. Now it's like we have to hit, otherwise we are in deep trouble.
Right. I mean, if you were like, let's say you were a freshman in 1997, well, by 2001, when you're graduating, you would have gotten a Final Fantasy game every single year.
That's true.
That you were in high school. Right.
And if especially if you include tactics or oh my gosh.
Yeah,
that's wild.
Yeah. And so like Final Fantasy was always like super relevant. Yeah. And now you may start like high school, you know, like a younger kid, like trying to get into the series or their target demographic. And, you know, he may go like his whole high school career and not even have a single Final Fantasy game come out.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I feel like
that's how you
that
lose
is probably
momentum.
a huge that's a huge problem for trying to attract a younger audience.
Yeah.
Okay. That's another great point to bring up. Good. So the landscape, the gaming landscape has changed so much since we were lads growing up playing Final Fantasy games once a year.
Those are
development costs have ballooned.
Yeah.
Team sizes have ballooned. The time to develop a game has just totally exploded and out of control.
Audience expectation has also
increased
ballooned
like crazy.
Yeah.
The whole market is far more competitive.
Yeah.
And we're at a point where, and this is something we've talked about a lot on our podcasts over the last year or so, the gaming industry seems to be reaching this place where it looks like a bubble is about to pop, and in some ways maybe has, with the way a game can come out and be fairly solid and had been marketed really well and just absolutely bomb and fail, and despite having a super talented team and making a really good game, and the entire team gets dissolved and a bunch of people get laid off, and it's just there are certain like tent pole examples that still make tons and tons of money, but it's more and more common to see a failed project be such a financial hit that it just totally devastates a studio.
Mm-hmm.
And with that being the reality of where we are, in particular talking about the AAA game industry, maybe we can look at some proposed solutions for the Final Fantasy brand and in its current place.
Right.
And what would be a good solution for them moving forward to have success more akin to what they once did. And one thing that has been proposed, and which you talked about in your video, was downscaling to more of a AA level production size and scale for the Final Fantasy main series. What are some of the arguments in favor of that? What do you think would make that a smart decision if they were to go that direction?
Okay, so if they were to go that direction, I think that we have seen a lot of AA successes over the past few years that have really kind of blown up. You know, the Persona series, when we go back to Persona 3, for example, that was a game where they had to essentially come up with ways to reuse the same environment over and over again. And the budget was really tight. And if I'm recalling this correctly, this was actually going to be Atlus's last game. So if Persona 3 wasn't successful, the studio was looking at shutdown. And so they came up with a really clever way to make a very long, in-depth RPG with an amazing story, great gameplay, and this very short AA game, and that turned things around for Atlus, right? And even still, while they've definitely scaled up the production quality with Persona 5, I was reading over Persona 5's development information, history, and background, and it had peak 75 people working on it during the peak of development. And I'm like, wow, that's crazy, because you look at these big AAA games and it's hundreds of people. If you look at something like Assassin's Creed, they have upwards of 1,400 people working on it. It's essentially an assembly line,
Right,
Another thing too is that I feel like when you're working on these AA games, the vision tends to be a lot more concentrated and potent, right? Because you're not working through several layers of both, one, making sure that this is something that, like, you know, will actually sell. Because with AAA games, if we're going to spend $200 million making a product, we have to do all the R&D, all the research, all these other things to make sure this is going to sell X number of units so that we get our investment back, right? And so in a way, you know, AAA games have this, they're made by what they believe is going to get them the best return, rather than allowing things to kind of be experimental for the sake of art. They don't have as much breathe room because they simply just cost too much to make. And they can easily tank the company, really. So, you know, there's a good case for, if you scale down to AA, you can kind of make a Final Fantasy game that doesn't need to sell all these numbers of units in order to sustain itself. The older generations of fans will probably still buy it. It doesn't have to be as graphically intensive. It can also afford to be turn-based, because I imagine it's much harder to convince investors that, yeah, we're going to do like a turn-based game with a AAA budget, when, you know, they're looking at like Elden Ring and like Monster Hunter and all these big AAA action games selling really well, and they don't really have much counterexample in the turn-based space other than, like, you know, Baldur's Gate. But I think that game took off for reasons other than turn-based combat. So, you know, and I think also too, and this is not necessarily the case, but it could reduce dev times. I say that's not necessarily the case because, you know, Metaphor ReFantazio or Persona 5, I mean, God forbid Persona 6, where is that at? It's been 9 years, Atlas. It's been 9 years. But like, you know, so it's not even necessarily the case that AA games take less time, but they can. You know, they definitely don't have to take as long as AAA games do, just because AAA games are just so exhaustive with resources. One of the reasons that, you know, Atlas does that is just because they work with such smaller teams and they make their own proprietary engines and all this other stuff. So they do take a lot more time on their games, but they can also afford to do that too. So,
okay. So one thing I also want to do really quick is sort of establish what AA even means. So you're calling something like Persona 5 AA. Am I understanding that correctly?
Right. Some people might push back on that. But when we generally talk about AAA in the industry, we're talking about the bigger, heavier hitters like the God of War, Spider-Man 2, these games that are taking hundreds of millions of dollars to make.
Yeah. So the budget for a game like Metaphor ReFantazio, Persona 5, are nowhere in the ballpark of something like a Spider-Man or a God of War.
Right.
So that's where we're delineating the difference.
Right. Exactly. And, you know, sometimes people get tripped up on that language. Some people are like, well, I paid $70 for the game. How is it not AAA? And I'm like, no, it's not about how much you pay. It's about how much the company pays to actually produce the title, and then you know, how much manpower they actually need in order to develop it. And yeah, but I'm like, you know, Metaphor is not costing as much as Cyberpunk 2077.
Yeah. And yet consistently, those Atlas titles seem to sell in that sort of 5 to 7 million range. Is that right?
No, P5 was the first one to like really do that.
Okay. Well, where is Metaphor currently sitting? Are we even aware of that?
We haven't gotten an update on it. It sold 1 million in like its first 24 hours, and we never got another update. I'm willing to bet it's probably pushing closer to 2 million by now.
Okay.
So
5 and below, maybe what, P4 and P3 are more in that 3 million range or something like that?
Yeah, I believe that like P4 is probably at like, I think P4 is at like 3-ish million.
Is that across all the versions? Because there's like a ton of versions.
Yes. Oh, they sold an additional 1 million after they released it on PC.
Nice.
Yeah, so they actually had a really successful late game PC launch, but part of that was because those games had been locked away for so long. Right. And so when they did come to PC, And then Persona 3 Reload also sold like 1 million on its first 24 hours. So I'm willing to bet that's probably at 2 by now as well.
Okay.
Nice.
Maybe some other examples we can point to as well are games like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, not the recent one that came out last week,
Hellblade 2,
which was a Microsoft-backed game, and that was definitely a AAA game. I'm talking about the original Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. And possibly we could also classify the upcoming Expedition 33 into that category.
Yeah, that seems to be the case.
Yeah. So calling something AA doesn't necessarily have to mean like it is somehow significantly visually inferior or something like that. I mean, these games still, I think, can come into the market and look like competitors in terms of like tech. It's not like it's so far behind that you upon first glance you're going, oh, that's definitely AA or something like that, which is I think where some of the confusion that Ryan is talking about comes from, where people are we really calling this AA? This is actually a super highly polished game, and Persona 5 is very stylish visually and all this stuff. So
I think AA has less to say about quality and more about just the cost of development, right? So, but a lot of people maybe not realize that. Like, oh, it's AAA if it's a good game, and it's AA. Like, that's not how it works, man. It's just it's mostly just about cost.
Cost and probably scale.
Yeah, sure.
So you're probably not going to get things like length, things like how large of an open world or something like that you might be able to have, versus a different style of game like Expedition's doing with more of the classic overworld map type of thing. You know, things of that nature. So I just wanted to make sure that we made that clear first, what we mean, the difference between double and AAA. So when we say, when we pitch this possibility of Final Fantasy moving to a AA game, that doesn't mean it's going to somehow turn into something that looks and feels so much lower in quality or lower than what you're used to necessarily.
No, it doesn't.
It just means, well, what do you think that would mean, Ryan? What would a AA Final Fantasy look like in your estimation?
So I brought up the sequels,
you know,
like 13-2,
sure,
Lightning Returns,
right? And those definitely, you could probably make an argue that those are maybe closer to the AA side in terms of budget, because they do make heavy asset reuse, they reuse the engine, and the budget on them is probably pretty cheap. But you know, one of the things that I would find concerning about Final Fantasy being AA is that I do feel like Final Fantasy post 7 or 7 onwards has been very much driven by spectacle, and that has kind of become kind of the core identity of Final Fantasy. Actually, you could probably argue like since 6, really, because I feel like 6 had some of like the most insane spectacle on a Super Nintendo, right?
Oh yeah.
So that spectacle has been really core to the essence of Final Fantasy, and I try to imagine the Final Fantasy games that we've gotten without that level of spectacle. And it does feel like something there would be missing, right? Could Final Fantasy X really be Final Fantasy X if you didn't have the sequence where Yuna dances on the water, right? Which I imagine was insanely expensive to animate in 2001.
Oh yeah.
You know, or the scene where like Sin is in the water and like the ship, and you have to fight Sin on the ship, and there's all the different angles. Yeah. And
that's a good point.
Right. And so whenever I think about the moments that Final Fantasy has kind of left an impression on me, the spectacle does play a pretty huge role in that, right? Like I remember like on a previous podcast I was listening to from you guys where Mike said that he went through and like spoiled himself like on all the movie scenes for FF7, right? Like, and that, but that's so like cool. Part of like why, it's like a part of like why it's so cool.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, if you take that away, do things feel less Final Fantasy?
That's a really interesting question. I'd like to ponder on that for a minute. And I'd like to point to something again. We're getting some great comments here, and I have been meaning to keep up with them a little bit more, but there's this one that just came up. It's again from Riker's Beard. Like has been pointed out above, the problem is Square thinks these games used to be sold on their graphics and high quality cutscenes, but neither has been the selling point since 10.
Well,
people
13,
largely people largely stick around for the world's characters and RPG gameplay. So that's his perspective on that. I'd like to maybe get some responses from the two of you on that point.
Yeah.
So is
13 is the
this
best
a
spectacle.
mistake, or is Square Enix mistaken that a large part of the? Because I would argue too that there was a focus on this at least since 7 internally.
Yeah.
That Final Fantasy needed to have cutting edge technology and spectacle and graphics to go along with that. Was a big part of its selling point.
But that's also what sold the Sony PlayStation. They weren't just selling the game, they were selling the console. And then the pushing the edge of what's possible is what Sony was really looking for them to do as well.
Now my question is, are they relying too much on that? Are they thinking that that is too much of the pie of the reason why people bought it and stuck around? Or are they it's a weird question to ask because I'm sure they are trying to write stories and build worlds and have characters that are just as impactful as those proved to be in the past.
Yeah, I don't think they're not trying to.
I'm not saying that they're going for graphics and trying to or that they're not focusing on this. What I'm saying is, are they assuming that there's a larger percentage of the pie for Final Fantasy success that was due to cutting edge technology and the fact that they haven't written a story in recent memory that has had that kind of staying power and sort of like long-lasting impact on the gaming audience as a whole.
Right.
That's, again, not to say Final Fantasy 16 is bad or Final Fantasy 13 is bad. I'm not making a personal qualitative statement on the games. Right. I'm saying that in comparison to what the gaming audience's response was to games like Final Fantasy 10 and 9 and 8 and 7, they have not embraced Final Fantasy 13, 15, and 16 in the same way. Right. They have not been that level of successful in their storytelling impact and power. So would it be beneficial for us in the state of the industry for them to say, let's scale back on the cutting edge tech and put everything we have into making sure that we have a story and a world and RPG mechanics and these sorts of things that are going to have those same returns as maybe was in the past. And what I'm saying is if they made that their focus instead, could they turn this around in the modern market and landscape to be something that is successful, that is bringing in returns on the smaller investments, and that grows as a brand in the way that something like Genshin Impact has or Persona has or something like that?
I like what you're saying. What you just talked about actually basically illustrated in my mind part of the problem here, which is that the graphical leap between consoles isn't what it used to be.
That's true too.
So when you were selling a game on Spectacle and you were coming out at the beginning of a new console and you were the best looking game there, that went a lot further in earlier consoles than it does now. Now, I think as Final Fantasy has maybe slowly lost some popularity and momentum that it's had, it's also done so at the same rate that spectacle in general between consoles is kind of diminishing as well. Or it's not diminishing, it's increasing at a diminished rate, right? The diminishing returns are not as impressive to people as they once were. So that would be an argument for saying, hey, the graphical chase, the spectacle chase is kind of a losing game because it's leveling off. Like, even what consoles and what everything is capable of doing, it's leveling off at a point where you might want to stop doing that. The trouble is people have come to expect this level of spectacle that we see now. And a lot of other companies are still going to take up that mantle and keep pushing forward. It's just the differences are going to be marginal now, whereas before it was a massive leap from FF6 to 7. It's just like, don't even have the words to describe Like it's basically a new dimension. Going from 2D to 3D is literally a new dimension, right? It's like it's just a different way of thinking in terms of, it's not even orders of magnitude. It's just a whole different thing altogether that blew people's minds. That's not happening again. Unless 4D somehow makes its way into our conscious minds.
Our universe.
Yeah, that would be insane. That'd be insane. But like even if it did, holy cow, nobody would understand it. But yeah, I just think it's a different field now. I'm kind of with where you're at the moment.
What are your thoughts on that, Ryan?
Wow. Yeah. Spectacle in general, like you said, is reaching diminishing returns.
Yeah.
But also, during that era of 7 through 10, nobody had fidelity quite like Square Enix at that time. The real-time graphics, the CG animation, it was so top-notch.
That's why they wanted to go and make movies. Yeah, because they were like, dude, we're doing this better than anyone. Like if we made a movie, it would kill, right? And maybe weren't super.
But now everyone's
but they were right in that they were the best in terms of the games, right? The FF9 cutscenes are just like otherworldly. They are so realistic.
Yeah, I just did a recent playthrough of like Final Fantasy X. And even watching those scenes at like 480p, like I'm still like blown away that this is like animation from like 20 years ago. Like I'm just like, this is so 24, 25.
24,
I'm like, dude, this is still so like, if I could just see these at like a higher resolution, even and like nothing else touched, just like put it in 4K, I'd still be kind of mind blown by that. So the problem like really is that everyone kind of has that spectacle now. Right. Like, I mean, you play God of War or Horizon Forbidden West, and all of those games look super incredible. I feel like, unless you like really want to be picky or, analyze textures or stuff like that, I really feel like most video games look pretty good nowadays. I've most.
Well, you just use the stock Unreal Engine assets, and it's like you already have a really good-looking game just right there.
Yeah.
It's like pre-programmed in.
Exactly. And so I think that the thing that kind of made them stand out with the spectacle also now is no longer necessarily on its own, at the very least, as appealing. Right. And so you can look at like Final Fantasy 16 and Rebirth, which are very good looking games.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, every game's a good looking game. So the spectacle, I do think, is still important. It is still crucial, like of an element to Final Fantasy is to, see like cool scenes and have cool moments. But also, too, I think that, the only way to really make it stand out is to have those cool RPG elements that other people aren't thinking of, right? Like even with like playing like the Re-Trilogy games, right? Like playing like Rebirth, for example, I still look at the materia system and I'm just like, why has no one else done this? Something like exactly. Like it's like the materia system is still like really good, right? Like that's like still like such a brilliant RPG mechanic. And I'm just like, wow, And so I do think that whenever you look at the mainline number games, though, they have not really dialed into those RPG elements as much. And I do think that fans are kind of missing them at this point.
Yeah.
So, kind of like with Riker's Beard's question, if I'm saying his username right.
Yeah.
I just feel like there hasn't been as much offered in the way of RPG elements as of late. I don't know how much that correlates to actual sales. I can say that like on like a personal level, that appeals to me as a Final Fantasy fan and just as a general RPG player. And I haven't been too big of a fan of them leaning out of that. And I'm hoping that whatever 17 ends up being, it leans back into those RPG elements. But yeah, it's hard to say that, they've betrayed one thing or like spectacle necessarily entirely. But I just think that they talk about modernizing the games a lot, but it feels like modernization has strictly meant action combat.
I know.
And it hasn't meant RPG elements outside of that.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I have really enjoyed actually about Re-Trilogy and about Rebirth in particular is that they do actually bring back those RPG mechanics in a big way. And so I also feel that like when you look around the gaming landscape, games in general have gotten more RPG and not less. Right. And so
That's
now
a good
everything
point.
has RPG mechanics.
Yeah,
right?
like
God of
sports games. Yeah.
Yeah, sports games. God of War is basically a freaking RPG now. You play like Ragnarok, for example, and it has all these RPG like elements to it, and you have builds and stuff like that. Zelda has also RPGified pretty hard, I feel like.
That's true.
Yeah, like Breath of the Wild is and Tears of the Kingdom are much more like what you could call RPG than previous Zelda games, which you could definitely label as strictly action adventure. So I feel like there is just a popularization of RPG mechanics that they're missing out on. I think Final Fantasy in particular really used to lead that space with just really innovative and fun growth systems. We don't get things like a junction system anymore, man.
Yeah.
Here's
the espers, the material.
I hear kind of the direction this conversation is going, and I think this is where I kind of arrive as a conclusion to my feelings on all of this, right?
Yeah.
And again, this is all barring whatever disagreements I've had about getting away from some of the traditional design philosophy of the games we grew up with. So I'm outside of my opinion on that mode and more in like the let's dissect kind of current markets and things of this nature. And being in that headspace, this is kind of where I feel like I'm arriving on this. So we talk about spectacle being a thing that was a little bit more exclusive to like some of the top dogs in the industry at one time.
Yeah, at one time.
And now it's more of there's a homogeny happening there.
Yeah.
It's like you're not the only kid on the block anymore. There's a lot of freaking games out there that are probably better looking than Final Fantasy is now. And
although the Balrog fight scene in FF16 was pretty good.
Yeah, they look great, right? They look awesome. I'm just saying that you're not the only kid on the block like you used to be on this particular thing. There is just a greater homogeny in general in the gaming industry. There's so much stuff that looks like everything else.
I know that's unfortunate.
I cannot even describe how deeply I felt that than watching the last couple of like Sony State of Plays or maybe even like some of the stuff that came off of the Game Awards. It's like, holy crap, dude, every game looks the freaking same as the one before. Yeah. It's like there's maybe like 3 genres that sort of exist as like the big AAA thing that people go after. And within those genres, everything looks exactly the same as the other.
I have noticed this.
It's like kind of insane to me how much homogeny there is.
Yeah,
so at this point, I don't think chasing that as far as like graphical fidelity within those 3-ish huge genre spaces does you any good.
Right.
There's too much competition and too many people doing it either just as good or better than you.
Yeah.
So this would be my argument for downscaling to AA.
Yeah, and also maybe even switching to Nintendo. You just basically outlined Nintendo's entire philosophy over the last 15 years.
Sure.
Of, look, we're not competing in this saturated market. We're doing something else.
So we're talking about, spectacle is such a big part of the identity of Final Fantasy, we can't lose that. Yeah. And what I want to do is sort of reframe what we mean by spectacle.
Okay.
Spectacle doesn't have to mean the absolute cutting edge realism in graphical fidelity. There are so many other ways one can achieve a sense of spectacle than that.
Yeah.
If you're to come to me and say Persona 5 doesn't have an incredible sense of spectacle,
it does.
Despite not having the graphical fidelity of a God of War, I would say that's crazy. Persona games have incredible sense of spectacle and scale to them, with the sort of that slice of life style, and you're like living a life in this place, and there's like so much to do there. But the game's cost and development and stylistic approach visually are what set it apart from this homogenized AAA industry. And when you see a Persona 5 game marketed at you and you go, holy crap, what is that? There's nothing on the market that looks like that.
Right.
All of a sudden you have a huge leg up in the market despite spending way less to make your game.
Right.
Right.
So if Final Fantasy, for example, who already has a legacy of an incredibly distinct visual style with the original concept art, right?
That's a good point, actually.
Like if they were to make, what's the name of the artist? It's totally escaping me.
Amano?
Amano.
Amano, yeah.
If they were to make a game that tried to capture as like accurately as possible a world of Amano's art as a Final Fantasy game.
Why haven't they done that?
That would be the most distinct looking game on the market.
This is true.
It would stand out from everything else.
You know what I love about this? This is true, and it would be true to form for Final Fantasy because that is the art that the pixels were meant to kind of look like from the beginning. And also, it would kind of what I was saying before, he has a very specific art style, and it is very Japanese, mixed with the Western elements. That would be adding a Japanese flavor to things that people will be able to notice right away and think like, whoa, and that's why it looks so unique and different, is that the way that Amano will draw these maybe Western-looking people in a Japanese style, it is so cool. It is so cool.
Yeah.
This is brilliant.
So what I'm not even necessarily saying, for those of you who may not like love his style or something like that they should do this. I'm giving you one example of how in downscaling your budget costs, but with thinking outside the box of what spectacle means, and in an attempt to escape the homogeny of the AAA industry, you could design something that would give you an advantage in the market while spending less.
Very good.
You could also then do that in many other ways. And this is part of, I think, a core piece of the identity of Final Fantasy as well. And when you go back to read those interviews from the old days, they all said that it was feeling limited. It was in the limitations that they felt were upon them that they got more creative. And I feel like
put those back on.
I feel like Kitase, even in recent interviews, has said things like, "I miss those days because we felt like we had to really think outside the box." And that's where I think the brand is. They're in a dead end of chasing the trends of
realism.
What's selling big right now. How do we make something like The Witcher or Elden Ring or these big sellers and compete in that space? And they have found no success in doing that in about 20 years. So I am actually a huge advocate for this idea, not even just for Final Fantasy as a brand, but just for basically every game developer out there.
Everyone should do this.
Scale back because the way it's going right now is not sustainable. So that's point number one. Point number two is I think Final Fantasy has had a bit of an identity crisis as a brand as a result of the decision to split the team up after Final Fantasy VII. So you had 8 being developed by one team and 9 developed by another team and an MMO team over here doing this thing. And then you had, this team developing 12, which was a totally different group than was doing 13 and its sequels, which was a totally different group from 14, which was a totally different group from 15, which is a totally different group again from 16, which was 14 kind of repurposed again. And then the 7R trilogy, they are all experimenting in different directions with gameplay styles, with storytelling style. And what this creates is brand confusion.
Yes, for sure.
Nobody knows who is not like dialed in the way that Night Sky Prince and we used to be. Like, who the names of these people are, or the fact that there are different business divisions making these games.
Yeah.
They look, all that they see, the public facing side of this is the logo, Final Fantasy,
Yeah.
and chocobos and moogles and things like that. And they go, oh, another Final Fantasy game. And they buy it and they go, what the fetch? This is nothing like the last one. What happened?
Yes.
What on earth is this? This is not at all what I expected from this.
And think about 16 and Rebirth, right? They launched 9 months apart from each other. And you have 2 games that are like 2 entirely different subgenres of like action RPG, where one's like a hack and slash and the other one's like an action turn-based hybrid, right? And so again, yeah, for the people that are super dialed in like us, we know, and they has 2 different teams, and like, okay, this is this team's lineage of Final Fantasy, and this is this other team's lineage of Final Fantasy. But for like normal people,
right?
Yeah.
it's like what?
They should just be different games.
Yeah,
different brands.
This
different
is what
franchise.
this is what people who are going to watch this video and who watch Ryan's content need to understand. We are all not normal. We are weirdos, dude. Like the fact that we got so into this, to have researched it and studied it and understood the history and know all the players behind the scenes, and we're reading the freaking like financial reports and like this is like unhinged behavior.
Yeah.
This is weirdo stuff, dude. Like we are not who they are trying to sell games to as a whole. We are a piece of that pie, and we may be an important piece of that pie, and you know, the day one sort of adopters that give it its initial launch boost. But we are not the ones sustaining its long-term success.
Right.
We need more normal people out there to be interested in this, and a normal person is going to play Final Fantasy VII Remake or something like that, and then. Or I don't know, maybe in Final Fantasy 14 or any one of these games, and be like, these are so different. It needs to unify. And I know that this is something that Ryan has spoke about a lot. And I think you advocate, and many others in your camp advocate, that maybe the kind of current gameplay loop for something like Rebirth and the battle system there should sort of be what they latch onto and say, okay, this is Final Fantasy's identity moving forward. Is that accurate? I don't want to speak for you.
Yes, that's accurate. So I feel like what they have going on with the re-trilogy essentially modernizes the classic 1 through 9 ATB system in a way that achieves the goal of creating a top-tier action game like they've been wanting to do, but also doesn't forsake its turn-based roots. So you can still pick it up and you can still see kind of the lineage of a turn-based game in there. You're still, you know, targeting enemies' elemental weaknesses, buffs and debuffs. Everything that you would expect to do in a Final Fantasy game is present there, but it's just in an action system. I also think that Re-Trilogy's combat is the way they hybrid action and turn-based together. I don't think that there's pretty much any other game like it. So it kind of satisfies that uniqueness quality that they currently need right now. That I don't necessarily feel as strongly that like say 15 or 16 were doing, because I do feel like you can find other action combat games that are sort of in the same vein within the same similar genre, right? Another thing too that's like really important to mention is just how short Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's development time was. So actually, there was a year gap between when they finished Remake and them actually starting Rebirth, and that's because they developed the PC port and they also developed the intermission DLC, and they did all of that in-house. So a year goes by, and then they start on Rebirth, and it only took them 3 years. And Naoki Hamaguchi, the director of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, was asked, you know, how did you guys make a very massive game? Rebirth is huge. Just the main story alone is like 50 hours, and like there's like 200 hours worth of content. Again, the main criticism about the game, other than like, you know, some people being contentious about narrative stuff, is that it's too big. There's too much stuff that it throws at you, and it's overwhelming at all times. How they did that in like 3 years, short amount of time, especially considering they didn't really reuse as many assets as they could have. And the reason that happened, according to Hamaguchi, was that they kept the team together. And so they had a steady pipeline. And so they got really efficient toward the end of remix development. And all that efficiency just transferred over into the next game. And they were reusing the same engine. So it was just like, oh, yeah, we know exactly how to make this. And, they're working within the same combat system. But what's so frustrating about all this, dude, is what you mentioned, is that they have a team making like, a Final Fantasy game. And then as soon as the game releases, the team is either moved off, like such as the case with like Luminous in Final Fantasy 15, and they went on to make Forspoken, or they just dissolve the team and put them on different projects.
Yeah.
But it's never the same guys. Like, okay, you made this Final Fantasy. Now we want you to make the next one right away. Like, transfer all of your skills and knowledge into making the next thing right now. And 7 Remake to Rebirth is like literally the only time that has actually happened. And pretty much every other time, it's just like, yeah, we're just gonna like get some other guy now to develop the next main Final Fantasy.
Yeah, this is exactly what I think the real problem is. It is a lack of coherence internally, unity, on a vision of what this brand even is. Yeah. What does it look like? What does it play like? What visual style do we sort of like lock into? What kind of stories do we tell? It's so different with sort of each mainline entry that there is no cohesion as a brand. And speaking strictly from a brand sort of supervision perspective, this is a nightmare. Yeah. Like, this is a really, really bad thing. I work in marketing. I have for many, many years, and that's almost always the first consideration when you're developing a brand and you want that to be strong and you want to communicate that well. They get so granular on everything, even down to, we only use this texture, this specific texture on the blue gradient background. Right. And if you do something different than that, then you're outside of the bounds of the style guide. And there's a very specific reason we use this one, and this is exactly how we make that. Right. And they go in, and if you're ever stepping outside of that as a designer, it's a like really, really bad thing. Yes, you must follow exactly what this says. It's very, very strict. And Final Fantasy does not seem to have something like that guiding its brand principles.
Now, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name, but over at Disney, there is a person, I think it's Kevin Feige. Is that his name?
I think that's right. Yeah.
His only job, and I think he's still working. His only job is to make sure that the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe like is coherent and makes sense and has some what you're talking about, some unity to everything, right? This was also what the girl Kathleen Kennedy was supposed to do with Star Wars, and I don't think she did it well, but Final Fantasy used to have this. It was a guy named Hironobu Sakaguchi. You might have heard of him. He was kind of that guy.
He was that guy.
Until he wasn't, and now I'm sure there's somebody
Kitase
who might
is
be doing this.
Supposed to be that guy.
But I'm not seeing the coherence.
But the thing is that Yoshi P has almost become as powerful as him. So now you have like almost like competing powers internally.
But then and that makes things even worse, because then you have CBU 3 Final Fantasy, you have CBU 1 Final Fantasy, and like you could be a Final Fantasy fan, but you're like nuh-uh.
It needs to be
the same as those Final Fantasy fans.
It needs to be one person. And you're right. No, I'm only a fan of the even Final Fantasies. The odd ones are totally different. I hate those guys. Right. So instead of Final Fantasy versus Dragon Quest, it's Final Fantasy odds versus Final Fantasy evens, and it's like you're
Unit 1 versus Unit 3.
Your own company now,
And I have seen that. I have seen people who, like, for instance, when 16 was coming out, there was like infighting within the Final Fantasy fan base between the Business Unit 1 Final Fantasy Remake fans and the Business Unit 3 Final Fantasy 14 and 16 fans about what the future of this thing should look like. This is just another example of brand confusion. You have infighting within your own fan base about what Final Fantasy should look and play like. That's bad. I'm not saying that's bad to make some sort of statement of, aha, I got you. I'm right about my feelings about Final Fantasy. That's bad from a business perspective. This is not
Right.
good for your brand. This is why you are seeing the declines that you're seeing. Because the non-weirdos out there don't know what this thing is. They don't know what to expect from it each time. And they go, last time I bought that thing, it wasn't what I thought, so I'm done now. That's the problem. So no matter what it is that they were to choose, I pitched my ideas for go with a strong Amano art style. You don't have to do my thing. I'm saying pick a thing.
Do something.
Pick it.
That's what Stranger of Paradise should have been, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Stranger of Paradise?
Totally.
That's what that should have been, was the Amano artwork game.
Yes.
Oh, man.
So that's another example. Like Strangers of Paradise. I mean, it just as again,
Right.
more
I forgot
brand
about that game.
confusion.
Yeah.
What a weird game. I'm not, again, not making a statement about its quality. I didn't even play the game. But another example of something so out of the realm of what the others are. It does not look anything like Final Fantasy 16 or 7 Remake. It does not play anything like Final Fantasy 16 or 7 Remake. And maybe that's okay for spin-off titles.
Sure.
But when we're talking about the mainline series, Final Fantasy 17 and 18 and 19, I'm saying 3 games back to back to back. They should
7,
have
8, 9.
a strong coherence and unity in their approach to these things.
And they're also,
if they want to grow again as a brand, that is the answer, in my opinion. Now, somebody put a quote here. I think it was Riker's Bearding, and they're quoting me. So pardon me for a minute for quoting myself. This is a quote that I put on our Discord years and years and years ago at this point. Final Fantasy hasn't been Final Fantasy for much longer than it ever was Final Fantasy. So to my mind, Final Fantasy not being Final Fantasy is the most Final Fantasy thing a new Final Fantasy could be.
You're right. You're in trouble. Like, because of what you just said actually made sense to me.
Yes.
That means Final Fantasy's in trouble.
Yes.
Like that, it spells doom for the brand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I believe inconsistency. I'll go ahead and say what you're
No.
Wait, hold on.
I want to pass it over. Okay, go ahead, Kaysen.
You just said the best English sentence I've ever heard, which is, I believe inconsistency. And that could be taken 2 ways, my friend. Where did you put the space? I'm just joking. Inconsistency. Yeah, it's a dad joke. I tell a lot of dad jokes nowadays, you know? It's just my thing.
Okay, so your point here on consistency. Let's hear it.
So, you know, it's really, as you said, with consistency and normie people not really knowing, but also too, like, how do you really build a following, right? Let's just suppose, hypothetically, we have a person and this person plays Final Fantasy 16 and they absolutely love it, all right? And they're like, yo, I want to play another game just like this.
Right.
And then they look at the 15 games before it, and none of them are like that.
Yeah.
And then they look at the games that are coming out after that, and they're like, oh, none of them are like that.
Like, what if Elder Scrolls 6 was like Modern Warfare 2 or something like that? Like, just straight up, just a totally different game.
Right.
People would be like, oh.
I mean, well, right. And like, think about like the Souls pipeline. Mike, I know you love Souls games, right? So it's like you play your first Souls game, and then you play the next Souls game, and then you go down like the whole Souls pipeline.
And there's a lineage.
And then you're right. And there's a lineage, and like before you know it, you own all the FromSoft games, right?
Yeah.
And I think part of the problem with the lack of consistency here is that you're gonna play, you know, maybe 16, and maybe you're new and you play like Remake or Rebirth, and then you say, what else is like that? And then nothing else in Final Fantasy is like that.
No, but
you know, like
problem.
there's no way to follow up. Right.
But there are other games not made by Square Enix that are not Final Fantasy that are like Final Fantasy 16.
Like,
in fact, there's several, and that's what you're going to go play instead.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's I think
you would go follow up with precisely. Like you would go play Bayonetta or Metal Gear Rising or Devil May Cry 5, right? But you know the chance. But if 16, for example, specifically clicked for you, and that's like the greatest game of all time, then do you go play Final Fantasy 7 Retrilogy? That's a turn-based action hybrid.
Yeah. And again, I want to emphasize this
it's
again.
a barrier to entry for new people.
What we are saying is true regardless of the quality of these games.
Yeah, I think
it doesn't matter
right.
if Final Fantasy 16 is among the best character action games ever made, and Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth is among the best hybrid action and command-based RPGs ever made, and Final Fantasy 14's expansion is one of the best MMO expansions ever made. It doesn't matter even if we were to argue that these are all insanely high quality. If you have that much disparity within a brand, this exact problem will still exist for you, where you'll have somebody who's introduced to this. You're trying to bring a new fan in, and they go, I love this, but then everything else in the brand surrounding it plays nothing like that. No. And I might not, now that's not to say a person can have more than one type of game that they like, and maybe they like this one too. But what I am saying is what you run the risk of is that one person who got into it for that specific kind of gameplay then has nothing else surrounding it that is like that, and then they fall off. Right. And that is where having a consistent brand, knowing what your vision is, knowing what you are and what you're trying to sell and what kind of fan base you're trying to garner is where growth actually happens. Yeah. And so that is, I think, the real answer here. Whether they downscale to AA or continue in AAA, whether they choose to go with something highly stylized visually or try to go with the continued kind of realism in the modern landscape, I can have all my opinions on that. But none of that is as important as brand consistency and unity and vision. And Final Fantasy has not had that in decades. Decades.
Yeah.
Multiple.
And that's I think what the real problem here is. So any last thoughts on that from your end, Ryan?
Also too, I just feel like having consistency allows you to make a better version of the last thing, right? Yeah. And that's something that they also haven't had in a long time. If you look at Final Fantasy 7, for example, you do not have Final Fantasy 7 if you don't have Final Fantasy 6.
Right, right.
And you don't have Final Fantasy 6 if you don't have 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Right. Yep.
And there is an evolution there where each time they kept arguably making better systems, better mechanics, refining what they had there. When you jump around to, and what's happening now is entirely different genres, you're never actually refining or seeing the potential in something. I don't think most people's, and maybe I'm not like entirely dialed into like the FromSoft community, but I'm going to use this as an example. I don't think most people's favorite Souls is like Demon Souls, right? Like it's the Souls games that came after where they evolved that formula and made it better, right? And then they reached a peak with games like Bloodborne and Sekiro and Elden Ring because they kept evolving what they had. How can you ever reach a point where something becomes, the best that it can be if each time you have a system that you never like really iterate upon? You just, essentially pump and dump. You create something and then you leave it. Like you abandon it.
Yeah.
And then other people then take it and make it better.
Yeah.
And I think you make a fair point too when you say that Rebirth is the first time that they took a system the first time in a while that they took a type of system and just improved it and made it better for a battle system. And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
That's something that they have deprived themselves of lately.
Yeah. Totally agree. Well, fellas, this has been an excellent conversation.
Well, it is, except
this has been good.
Yeah. This has been a good conversation. I think Square Enix, Final Fantasy should be single A.
Single A, dude.
I think.
Wow.
Do you make it into oblivion?
$1 million budget. $1 million budget. You got a team of 7 people. What can you do?
Yep.
There you go. That's it.
Lowercase a.
Yes, lowercase a.
We need lowercase a
let's
Final
see what
Fantasy
they can do.
as soon as possible.
As soon as possible. And then they can make one a year and it'll be dope.
Anyway, we hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for being with us again, Ryan. Go check out Night Sky Prince on YouTube, Night Sky King on X. This episode has been brought to you by Night Sky King on X. Please go and boost his channel over there, his page. He needs to get back to his 17,000 followers. So you guys know when his videos come out. Appreciate your perspective. Conversation's always great, and we'll do this more often when we have in the last year and a half or so. But
yeah, invite me anytime. I'm always down to come on.
Yeah, appreciate you, man. All right, dudes, we're gonna take off. Have a good week. Peace out.
Adios.